My wife has reminded me of the need for a backstory to explain, who I am and what's going on and everything. Well, that would blow the whole night. But maybe you can read on the jacket right here. Can you read that? No. It says Coach McConnell. Yeah, and over here, I coached in the neighboring county for a long time, a really long time. And I never knew that's what I'd be. I never knew that I'd be identified as coach. When I came to Patrick County High School, when Ann and I came to Patrick County in '72 in the fall, the deal was, if you're a male and not crippled, you're going to coach football. And even then, if you're relatively mobile, you're going to coach football. We had a football coach that spoke Russian, of all things. Not that it did him any good. He was only a coach for 1 year. But I coached football for 13 years. And I'll throw my record up against a few. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. I learned from a smart man. He had introduced football at the school. When we came, we tell people that the paint was still drying on the building. We came in the second year of the school. So I coached for 13 years. Football, that is. I never knew what would have come from my sister-in-law's employment in the placement office at Radford College. To go to a backstory, the principal and the director of instruction at Patrick County were standing in her office one day saying, "Where are we going to find an English teacher who can coach track?" And Helen says, "I know." And that's the beginning of the story. And never would have known, never would have guessed what it came to. Ann has practiced nurse in at least 6 different aspects of her profession, which is really cool. And I've just coached and taught and coached, and like forever. When I retired, I explained that a coaching season is like a dog's life. A dog is 7 years to 1. For a coach, it's 2 to 1. So when I retired, I was 104. I never knew that this would lead to, in '89, the principal's son wanted to run. The principal can dictate whatever happens in the building, whatever's going to happen. This boy wanted to run, so I went from off-season conditioning to cross-country coach, which was kind of cool because cross-country had stopped. They didn't have anybody to coach it. And one thing led to another, and I went, I had an individual, I had him. And eventually, a couple of years later, we had a full team. We went to our first inter-district meet as a team. I didn't know how to keep score. Talk about stupid. Talk about a rookie. So I didn't know we'd won the meet. And if only I'd known how to keep score. I learned a lot. No, I won't tell you that. That's bragging. I won't do that. But I coached after I retired. Our girls' team is the only girls' team to have a regional title, so we did that. I never would have known that this was how I would prefer that people address me. I had a football coach in high school who was a jerk, an absolute jerk. Nobody would pattern himself or herself after him as a coach, and I didn't. But I wouldn't have thought that I would be Coach McConnell. What else can I say? Except that if only I had known, would I have pursued what I thought might have been a career in making things with my hands, and as it turns out, I'm doing a few things. No, I taught football, cross country, and track because I encountered people who didn't know what the hell was going on. But most of the people who walked in my room spoke English, so that was better. I could teach English. But I'm telling you, if only I had known that, I really wanted to be known as Coach McConnell, I wouldn't have believed it. I wouldn't have recognized it. I wouldn't have acknowledged that became a preeminent in my life. And I'll tell you, the downside of it is that I came to recognize long after I retired that I raised a lot of other people's kids and didn't spend enough time with my own. And I've apologized before, but it's true. So, if you only knew what that little thing at the beginning, would you change from all-season conditioning to conditioning my son? And so, yeah. If only I'd known what it'd lead to. It's been cool. It's been quite a ride. Thank you.
In a lot of ways, the topic for this week proves the futility of trying to plan for these, because I spent a long time, I even talked to Marcia about, I never knew, covers pretty much all of my life. How do you pick one story out of that, considering you're born knowing nothing and die knowing even less? And then this week, yesterday, in fact, this story handed itself to me gift wrapped. I hope you guys find it as interesting as I did. I never knew why people got tattoos. That's cheating a little bit. I never understood why people got tattoos. And I don't say that out of any anti-tattoo bias. To put it in context, I've always viewed people who had tattoos the way the girl wearing thick glasses and an oversized sweater going home to do her schoolwork views the girls drinking bourbon in the bleachers after school. I had a lot of envy, a lot of desire to join in, and a feeling that I wasn't cool enough that I rationalized myself in whatever way made me feel the most comfortable at any given moment. I never knew that there was an alphabet. It's a medieval Irish alphabet where every letter represents a tree. It represents a sound. And in the original Gaelic language, the first letter or first sound of that tree it represents the letter. So like in English, it would be, you could say apple or birch or something of that sort. Well, I found out that there's a letter for willow. The letter is, as far as I can tell, pronounced saya. It's written like this, vertical line with 4 horizontal lines coming off of it like fingers. And in delving into this, it's called the Ogham alphabet, spelled O-G-H-A-M, just like it sounds, because Gaelic. And willow in that tradition is associated with water, with the moon, with very strong feminine energy. And as a kid, well, all my life, but especially as a child, I was always very fascinated with water. And I used to wistfully tell my parents that I wish there was some way that I could drink the moon, if such a thing were possible. I believe that in an authorial tradition, as well as in our daily lives, foreshadowing is most often observed in retrospect. I had this validated by something Ray Bradbury wrote, that authors often figure out their own foreshadowing only after they finish the story and they go back to do editing. And I believe that's true for us as well. I joked that I chose my name out of convenience. I had a whole other name picked out for myself. And I would go to introduce myself as Will, and I thought if I'm going to keep making this mistake, I might as well have a name that I can remember. But I don't believe that that was a coincidence. I don't believe there are any coincidences. I don't believe that I simply chose that name out of convenience. And I never knew that I wanted a tattoo until I discovered this letter. And I'm getting it this Tuesday. All right.
Okay. I doubt whether I would be up here if it hadn't been for Willow reminding me what the theme was this week, because then I started thinking about it. So I'm going to tell this story, and it's a story really about my grandmother in a lot of ways. My grandmother always, when I was really young, always seemed pretty happy and so forth. And I told once a story about my grandfather where the two of them invited me over to their house for my birthday and then proceeded to put a piece of watermelon in front of me and sit there and watch me eat it, which was really unnerving. It's like they didn't even eat with me. And then afterwards I realized, well, it was probably the last piece of a really good watermelon and they wanted me to have it. And they wanted to enjoy my facial expressions. And I was like, yeah, but this is really hard. So I don't even know if I enjoyed the watermelon because I was kind of nervous about that. But anyway, my grandmother was not real outgoing. She spent a lot of time in the house, and I was very much a tomboy. And when I was probably, I'm guessing, about 11 years old, my grandfather died. And it took the spark out of my grandmother. It really took the spark out of her. She, I think in a lot of ways, didn't want to live after he died, but she was there. And I would go to visit her, and sometimes she would be okay, and other times she would unnecessarily say something that just hurt me to the core. You know, and it was really confusing to me. I realize now that she wished she was dead. She wished she had died when Grandpa died, because she did not really want to live without him. Now, we would go to this apartment complex where my grandmother lived. It was an assisted living complex. We would go there on Sundays and eat in the dining hall with my grandmother, Sunday lunch. Now, I'm guessing most of you that know me probably haven't ever seen me in a dress, because I don't really like wearing dresses. I'm a tomboy, right? More of a tomboy. This one Sunday, I happened to wear a dress to church, and then, of course, to Sunday lunch with Grandma. And about 2 days later, I got a letter in the mail from Grandma. And basically, all the letter said was, "It was so nice to see you in a dress." I was like, okay. Now, Grandma had a lot of issues. She couldn't walk very well, so it was hard for her to get around. And as time went on, she became more and more limited in what she could do, and like old people do, and the body's breaking down. And eventually, my grandmother, or no, I got to tell another story first. My mom, when I was in college, ended up having what was diagnosed as a benign brain tumor. And I had gone away for the weekend, but I was coming back, and I was gonna be there in time to go and be at the hospital with her the night before the operation and to be there during the operation. And I came back, lo and behold, they had moved the operation up a day. And I didn't get to see her before she went into the operation. And I was really upset about that. And my sister said, "Oh, it's okay, go on to class, go on to college class, and when you come out, we'll probably know what's happened and we can tell you." And so I went to college class. I probably didn't get much out of it, but I went, and I came back, and I immediately called my grandmother because I figured that she would know what the prognosis was or whatever. And they didn't have cell phones back then. I called my grandmother, and as soon as she realized who it was, her response to me was, "Alan will be right there. That's my brother, my oldest brother." And then she hung up. Well, you can imagine, I thought my mom had died or something. I was really upset. My brother came, and I was out on the street waiting for him. And he said, no, Mom's alive. He said it was cancer. Now, my grandmother and my grandfather had never really liked my mom. But I think my grandmother was coming to terms with the fact that she really had been a good mother. And she was feeling bad for what we were going to be going through. And she's not someone to ever share emotions. She never was. In fact, you read her diaries after she died, and it just is matter of fact, we did this. We were on our honeymoon, we got stuck in the mud, Grandpa pushed us out. It's like, oh, that's exciting, okay. Anyway, grandmother was on her deathbed. She was in the hospital, and she had congestive heart failure. And I said to my dad, I said, I don't really know anything about Grandma. I don't know anything about her history. And he said, well, you could always ask. Now, realize she's struggling breathing. And I go in there and I'm like, you know, Grandma, I just really feel bad that I never asked you anything about your history, about your past. I don't really know anything about your past. So Grandma told me a story in between labored breaths. And she told me a story about when she was very pregnant with her first baby and walked across the farm field to get to a cousin's house to visit, because back in those days, you weren't supposed to be seen by anybody out in public except relatives. You could go to a relative's house. And it was, the middle of winter and snow, and they were like, you walked over here? And Grandma was like, I just had to see somebody. And then she told me another story about when my dad was born and his older sister came in the room to see this new baby and came running back out and said, the baby's chewing on Mom. And the last story she told me was that when my dad was real little, he came upon this bottle of kerosene. And I guess nobody was watching him real closely. He drank it. Back then, they didn't have the hospitals and the doctors right at hand. And my grandpa sat there with the baby, with Dad in his arms. And I think they probably just prayed and prayed and prayed, and his body was totally limp. But eventually it came back. And I never knew about the history, and I feel like there's so much more that I could know if I had just asked earlier.
I may have what some people could consider a lowbrow sense of humor, so I'll apologize ahead of time if anyone feels that this is a little bit inappropriate. But I've been working in sales and technology sales, computer sales for, the last 8-10 years. And I came over to a new company, a startup company, about 8 years ago to grow a territory out. And so it meant a lot of cold calling and a lot of meeting with new people. And I got an appointment with this company, with a guy from a company that did self-publishing. So if you're an author and you want to put a book out there, but you're not good enough to have a publisher, you sign up with them, and they basically print books as they're requested, right? It's like on-demand publishing. So I managed to get a meeting with this guy, and it was kind of under false I kind of got my way in when I shouldn't have got my way in. So we're at lunch, and I'm a naturally curious person, so the conversation had gotten to a bit of a lull. And I asked him, I said, well, being in self-publishing, what what's the weirdest book that you've ever been asked to publish? And he said, well, there was this book called The Natural Harvest, and it's about, it's recipes, it's a recipe book about cooking with human semen. So, I immediately spit out whatever I was eating for a second and contained myself and thought that was, I never knew that anyone would come up with the idea to make a recipe or even cook with that. But so the meeting, it ended, and I thought it had gone very well, but he went dark on me, which is a sales term meaning someone won't call you back at all. So I came up with the great idea that I was going to order this book and send it to him with the note asking him if he wants to do lunch, because I thought that would be a good idea. I've always had more balls than brains. So I ordered the book, and I'll tell you, I wasn't disappointed at all when it showed up. It had a lot of illustrations. I think some of the recipes that stood out were on the dessert section, there was Fred's Flan or something, I think it was called. And the one that actually made me a little bit queasy were the man-made oysters, which was pretty bad. So after I finished flipping through the book and showing everyone in the office this book because it was so strange, I put it in a FedEx package and I sent it. FedEx. Everyone likes a FedEx package. I put it in the FedEx package, sent it to the customer, and never heard from that guy again. Surprisingly, however. A few things happened. One is I had no idea that when you ordered a book from this company that it sent the author an email with your contact information that you ordered the book. So I did get a very nice email from the author of the book asking me to share any feedback on any of the recipes, as well as if I had any recipes of my own to send them to him, because he's thinking about doing a second volume of this book, because you can't get enough recipes on cooking with that, apparently. The other thing I didn't know is that, I've been fairly successful in sales and in technology sales. It is a small world. What I didn't know is that would be the one thing that people remember me by, because I was telling the story to someone else that we made an acquisition of another company. The guy came over, and I'm telling this story. He's like, holy shit, that was you that did that? So, I think that's all I have to, that's my story.
That was great.
Christel, okay? That's all right. I'm going to tell you two stories. They're not related at all. The only thing is they're my stories, okay? The first one, and I remembered the topic as if I had known. But it doesn't matter. It comes out the same way. When I came to this country, I was almost 20, like 19 and a half. I was traveling by myself, and I was on the last leg. I traveled on the Greyhound bus. I had this wonderful $99 ticket for 99 days. And I cheated because I traveled 109 days. Anyway, on my last trip, that was from San Francisco to Los Angeles. Now, I was going to Los Angeles. Remember that. My mother had a friend from school who lived in the Los Angeles area. She had no address. She just says, just go there, look in the phone book, look them up. And I thought, I'll do that. So here I'm on the bus, nice, finding a good seat. And in comes this guy, just as we were trying to leave. Good-looking guy. But I thought, he should sit up front. No, he had to sit right next to me. Now remember, this is, what was it? It was 1968. I had long hair and short thoughts. Okay, it was hippie time. If you were there, you know what I mean, okay? So this guy sits next to me, and he is all over me. And he was so good looking that I enjoyed that. And he kept getting, more and more fresh. And he kept, I said, where are you going? He said, I'm going to LA. So I thought, oh, good. And so he kept pushing and pushing. I said, just wait till LA. Well, we drive into Los Angeles, and he gets up. I didn't know that LA and Los Angeles were the same place. Remember, long hair, short thoughts. I was committed. And so after 2 days, he wanted to get married, and I said, oh, no, we're not going there. So I took off. I went back to England. First I went to Germany, then I went to England. He had nothing better to do than to follow me. And I thought, God, this guy is nuts. I married him. And I suffered through this man for almost 21 years. So that's story number one. I paid for not knowing, right? Story number two is when I came to this country, like I said, I was almost 20. The only thing I ever experienced in my life with the skull and crossbones was at the pharmacy when it was poison, or old history books where it was talking about the recent history of my country, right? So I come here, and what do I see everywhere? Skeletons, crossbones, skulls. And I thought, what is wrong with these people? They are obsessed with death. And then I moved to Los Angeles, where 60% of the population is Mexican. And they have this day called El Día de los Muertos, translated, the Day of the Dead. And to me, that sounded like African ancestor worship. I didn't understand that. And I thought it was very macabre that you go make a big party, you go to the graveyard, you sit at the grave, and you eat your food and whatever. And I thought, this is so really macabre. This is disgusting, actually. And I lived with that thought for over 40 years until in 2017, we went to Stewart and at Halloween with my girls. And they showed this giant movie there called Coco. It's a Mexican movie. And I don't know, for some odd reason, it made me stop and look at that movie. And I found so much good in the explanation of El Día de los Muertos that it gave me the courage. Then when one of my friend's wives died recently, I was able to write him a letter that one of my other friends who I read the letter to, he said, I would frame it. Because it's a beautiful day. For as long as you remember a person that is no longer with us, they are not dead. And that I didn't know. I do now, and I'm not paying for that one.
All right. Well, I've always been kind of obsessed with explosions. And anything from like shooting hairspray through a lighter, or baby powder is also a good one. Firecrackers, really anything that explodes or makes fire. And I've always been looking for the next biggest explosion. So I started with these little party poppers. There's these little plastic things, you pull the string and shoots confetti everywhere. But I wanted something bigger, and I've always looked at these big cardboard tubes filled with confetti and a fair bit of gunpowder. You twist the bottom and it shoots confetti everywhere. So I've always wanted one. And for this last Christmas, my sister, Ella, decided to get me one. And I was so excited. I kept it in my room, and I just look at it every day with longing until New Year's Eve came. I was really excited at the beginning of the day. I brought it downstairs and set it on the table. I'd pick it up like every 20 minutes just to play with it and wait for the moment. And The clock slowly ticked on. It was about 11:30, and I kept picking it up about every minute or so and putting it back down. And we finally got to the last minute. This is the last minute of 2019, almost the 2020s. And we got down to the final minute. I couldn't contain my excitement. I was like writhing with the confetti cannon in my hands. So the clock gets down to 10, and I have the confetti cannon all ready, and I was freaking out. I have it on video. I'm just losing my mind. And so we get down to about 5 seconds, and then finally, the final second, the first thing I did in the 2020s was shoot that confetti cannon straight into the ground. I never knew exactly how they worked. Yep, that's it.
You never knew, I never knew, I think what's the theme? I never knew what being a dad was going to be like. And we had a hard time getting pregnant, and it wasn't my fault. But we finally got pregnant. We finally got pregnant, and so we were excited to have a baby on the way. And we found out that there was a, you ready for this, dear? Okay. So my daughter had a meningocele on her back, which is, if you're not medical, you probably wouldn't know, that it's a little bubble of skin that is barely protecting the spinal column. So if it pops, you're talking about possibly it's a disease, I forget the name of it. Spina bifida, right, thank you. So you're talking about spina bifida, serious disability. Will the child be able to walk? We were scared to death. And so we get through this, and my daughter comes out, Ruby comes out, and the other thing was, I was sure that we were having a boy. Because we were, they did the MRI, and we weren't going to find out what we were having. We were just going to be surprised. And so we said, okay. So then I looked at the MRI when I wasn't supposed to look, and I thought I saw something that wasn't there, but something wasn't there. So we had a girl, and I was the most surprised at all. And so we went through the surgery, and that was very challenging, very, heart-stopping moment. And the surgery went fine, and my daughter can walk, and that's just fantastic. But the ringer was plenty. So to give equal time, I'll talk about my son's birth, because I never knew that it could get more dramatic than that. So we're living in Columbia, Virginia, which is between Charlottesville and Richmond. It's even smaller than Floyd, and it's so small there's no cable. Serious outback. And so we're there, and we're talking to the midwife, and she says, how are you doing? And I was just being conversational, saying, oh, we're good, no problem. My wife's water broke. So we're there in Columbia, and before that, I guess the backstory to that is we lived in Richmond for a while, which is near Columbia, and we had a mean dog because we lived in a rough neighborhood. So when this mean dog got free, we had a serious liability on our hands because he'd bitten someone before, and so we had to be careful about that. So the dog gets out, and my 9 months pregnant wife is running up and down a gravel road trying to catch the dog, and the dog is very amused that someone's running after him, and will turn around and look and smile at you once in a while, let him catch up to about 5 feet, and then take off again. So he does that, and things are getting looser and ready to go. So my wife is in deep, there's kind of a trance you go into when you're giving birth, and I think it's because your pain is so severe that you have to kind of step out of go into an altered consciousness where you're kind of not really all there, because you got a lot going on. And so, so my wife is in this trance, and her water is broken, and she says we need to go to the hospital. And I thought, awesome, I love driving fast. This is the best excuse to floor it down, Route 6 that I can think of. No cop is ever going to give me a hard time about that. They're going to say, oh, sure, go to the hospital, dude. But she wouldn't let me drive fast. But it was funny because when we got the car, and it had my daughter's baby seat in it, and she just grabbed that seat and chucked it out of the car, and she no regard for that seat whatsoever. But we were ready, and my wife's in the back seat. We weren't as ready as we thought we were. But my wife's in the back seat, and we get to Oilville, which is about halfway to MCV in Richmond, and my son decides it's time to come out. So we're there, and now the cop does show up because we've called 911, and he's saying something intelligent like, "Is she okay?" Well, she's 9 months pregnant, and we're 30 minutes from the hospital. Yeah, we're pretty good. So Oscar comes out, and I actually did pretty well I did not freak out until after he was born. But once I heard he was crying, and I saw that he was a boy, I thought, okay, now I've got two. And we cut it off at that point. We don't have any more kids. We're not having any more kids because we figure the next birth would be even more dramatic.
If I only knew. I did know because my psychic told me so. I was 35 years old when I went through a divorce. At that time, I went into perimenopause, which I don't know if that's common or not, but everything ceased. The doctor says you don't use it, you lose it. And I had a 9-year-old son who said, "You will not date or I will leave." But then again, that was the last thing on my mind. I was into earning a living, making life, just getting through every day. So we moved from Vermont to Florida, and I started working at a huge bookstore, at a Books A Million, and I was the operations manager for that store, and got into a nice rhythm. It was a good place to be. Once you work even in a huge store, you start to recognize your regular customers and those who come in for their cup of coffee every day. And there was this gentleman who came in. He was about 15 years older than me. At that point, a couple years had gone past, and I took notice of him. He brought in his adult son to meet me. He brought in his sister, who was visiting from Ohio. We started meeting to have a cup of coffee when he was done with his work, and they'd call me back in the office, and I'd come out. And at this point, my son, who was now 13, he said, "Mom, I don't know why you're not dating. You should be dating." I'm like, "Thank you, Taylor. Okay." So when this fella, and I'm not going to call him by his real name, I'm going to call him Mark, because that's what I call every man whose name I can't remember. Mark. So Mark and I start going out on dates, but we're we're both history nerds. We're interested in geography and just not your typical dates. We go to the library resource room or something like that. But gradually, we started getting a little closer, and he asked me if I wanted to go out of state for a couple days. He had a business trip. He owned a factory, actually. And so I said yes. And no more perimenopause, just in case you were wondering. It's amazing how hormones know these things in your life. But at the same time, I started going to a psychic. I am a Christian, but I'm a spiritualist also. I'm a Christian spiritualist. I talk and listen to guides and angels and dead people, whatever. I was born that way. What can I say? Whatever. And so I go to see Nora, and she says, Beth, the guides tell me this guy is married. I said, he's not married. And she said, that's just what they're telling me. I said, oh, he makes me laugh. He's not married. That's just crazy. So in the meantime, he tells me that he lives in his mother's condo because she had had a stroke and was in a nursing home. And I had been a nurse, a geriatric nurse. So I'm like, I'll go visit your mom in the nursing home. And so I went to visit her, and she could not talk. And I said to Mark, I said, can I have your sister's address in Ohio? And I'd like to write her updates. This is back in the 90s, you know, we didn't even have email or anything yet at that point. I'd like to write her updates about your mama. And he said, oh yeah, I'll get it to you. But he never did. And one day I was visiting her, and I saw an envelope that had her address. I said, oh good, here is Sue's address. So I started writing to her, and she'd write back, and we formed a friendship. But I never told her. She was a really good, straight Christian woman, and you know, not a spiritualist Christian. She was a Christian woman, and so I just told her I was friends with her brother. Didn't go into any details. One day I receive a letter. I was excited, you know, nice handwritten letter. And I go out by the pool and behind our house, and I'm sitting there, you know, having a soda and a cigarette. And I open this letter up, and she says in it, she said, Dear Beth, my aunt died and left us a condo. Now we don't have to stay with Mark and Margaret anymore. I'm like, holy, whatever. What is going on here? Well, guess what? I knew that. I already knew it because the spirit guides had said. But I got on the phone real fast, and I got her number in Ohio. I said, Sue, please tell me he's not married. I have never committed adultery in my life, and I don't want to have started now, even inadvertently. And she said, no, Beth. He told Margaret, who is his ex-wife, 3 years ago that if she moved back in, he'd never cheat again. I said, what do you mean again? And she said, he's been married 5 times. The whole time we were growing up and he was older, there would be women knocking on the door saying, I have Mark's baby. Uh-oh. This is on YouTube. But that's all right, it's the truth. They can't get you if it's the truth, right? So, anyway, you never know, or maybe you do know, how naive you can be, even when you think that you're not. But it also pays to listen to those inner voices that tell you. Thank you.
Well, I never knew why my mother hated alcohol so much. She wouldn't drink, and she wouldn't let anybody in the house who she suspected drank. And that definitely limited the scope of our friendships in the town where I grew up. We would have the preacher to dinner sometimes, or we would have the preacher's wife sometimes, but we didn't have the people next door or the people down the street. Or the it was just not in the realm of things. And I never knew why. She wouldn't explain it except to say, it's wrong, you mustn't do it. If I ever catch you, you know what. And then, well, you know, children adapt, teenagers adapt. You grow up, you go off to college, and your grandparents die. And in my case, when my mother's mother died, her oldest brother came to live in his parents' house. And so he sort of just took up where his parents left off. And the house didn't really get cleared out until he passed away. And while my mother and her sister were cleaning out the house, back in the back of a shelf in the kitchen, they found a school kid type spiral notebook. And in the spiral notebook, Grandma had written a journal. And as she explained it, on dreary, rainy days, she would write down what she could remember about what her life had been like. And one of the stories in Grandma's journal was how she grew up the daughter of an alcoholic father. And they were as poor as thin cornmeal mush. They were really pitifully poor. And her father not only abused alcohol, he abused his family. One story that she told, Grandma and her little brother were asleep in their pallets, and her dad comes in he's been out drinking, and he's hungry, and he wakes up Grandma, who's, I believe, about 9 or 10 years old at this point, wakes her up, make me some food, I gotta have some food. And there wasn't anything in the house except some meal and a couple of fish that they had caught the day before. So she cooks up the fish, and he makes a meal out of it and goes storming off and goes to sleep. But the idea of this 10-year-old girl sleeping in a drafty cabin, and there's no food in there except what drunken daddy gets, and then when the children wake up, they don't have any food.
all of us remembered that. All of us have talked about it, and we remember why Grandma, for as long as we knew her, Grandma was the greatest friend of the revenuers up here on the mountain. Women would come to her and complain about their husbands were off making whiskey somewhere or drinking with the guys that were making whiskey. And Grandma would use the old crank telephone and call down to Stewart and ask somebody, do you want to buy some eggs? I will have some eggs next Tuesday. And what none of the neighbors knew at the time was this was code. This was how she let the sheriff know that she had information. You know, on a party line, you really have to be circumspect. So we found out all this stuff after Grandma was gone, and it did help us understand her, and to some extent it helps us of my generation understand ourselves. Some of you know that just about every Thursday I'm over at Dogtown having a drink. But I know that it's in my genes to have too many, so I watch myself pretty carefully. The other thing that I want to say is I am so thankful that Grandma took the time to write that journal and help us know her better than we ever would have dared to ask her about things. If you have children, start writing, folks. They will thank you for it.
Thank you, John. That was wonderful. Could you please...
So, I will say straight away, I didn't come with the story, and so I hope this works. But what I didn't know was really how to be a student. I was not, well, first of all, I'll say I went to school in a very small town, and I would say it was not a great educational institution, but I got an education, and it was always understood you will go to college. I had no real choice. It was known that I would go to college. So, okay. After working for 2 summers in a button factory, I was pretty sure that I needed to be out of that town, and so maybe college was a good idea. But I didn't really get it. I didn't really understand what it takes to be a student, what it really means to inquire in the way that that matters most, that takes you to new places, that engages you in special ways. And I muddled through. I did graduate. I did end up with an education that got me through. And then I realized, oh, I don't have a job. I don't really have skills. I floundered. And then I went to graduate school, and I got very, very specific skills so that I knew what I was going to do. And that really launched me into a career that lasted 30 years. But what I wanted to say is that, and so what I'm getting at is the point of the topic is I didn't know. Well, I really didn't know. So my nephew proceeded to have a family, and he has 3 beautiful daughters, and the youngest one has come to visit us here in Virginia from Las Vegas. You know, we offered her an option to, all 3 of them, they could come. We would pay the ticket. She came at 13. She came at 15. And she came again when she was trying to figure out which college to go to. She had gone to, in Las Vegas, the School of the Arts, and she was determined, her vision for a path. She had a path. She was going forward. She knew what she wanted to do. And she was going to be a theater lighting designer. She was sure. She knew exactly what she was going to be. And so she came again at 17, and she went to an interview at the School of the Arts in North Carolina. Well, the School of the Arts in North Carolina is ranked the third in the country. She said, I only applied to the top 3 because I knew if I was going to do this, I would be wanting one of the top 3. And I'm thinking, how can you know this? How can you be so smart? You're only 17. And I'm thinking, wow. And then after the interview and the whole day at the school, the touring, and I'm thinking, wow, she is really going to, if she goes to this place. Now, I have to say, going from Las Vegas to Winston-Salem, maybe not such a good idea. You're kind of not really meant for that kind of switch, I think. But it's one of the top 3, so you know. Well, she had applied to the other 2 as well. But at that interview, she said, as we were driving for dinner that night, she said, you know, the thing is, when I'm at high school, I know I can do this stuff. I just kind of make it happen. You know, it's all just by chance, I think, but it always turns out. And so she said, I really want to know why. I want to know the why does it work? If I make these lights happen right, why? And so I want more depth. I want to get it. I want to understand. And I'm thinking, how can you know all this? How can you be such a student of anything? I mean, I don't get it. How can people know these things that they need to get it? And yet, you know, it did happen and I got it at some point, but you know, I was just so impressed. And we talked and we decided we'll help her achieve her goal. She's a student. She needs, wherever she's going. My nephew had no money to put behind. I mean, they just were making it. And so it really happened that we were able to help. And she ended up choosing DePaul University, ranked number 2. She was only on the wait list for number 1, which is Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. But she got into number 2, and that's where she is. She's in Chicago. She's loving it. She's having a great time. And then she's in her sophomore year, and we have an agreement. She's going to write to us and tell us how it's going. And that's part of her deal for us helping her. And she writes the first year with prodding, but she does. And it's amazing. Her writing is great. So then she tells us nothing. She tells us nothing. It's December, and they run on quarters. She's supposed to tell us, how did it go? What's next? What are your grades? That's the deal. Nothing. And finally, I write to my nephew. I text him, and he says, this is not acceptable. Absolutely, I'm getting to the bottom of this. So finally, I mean, it's like it goes on and on, and finally, it all comes out. She had a crisis. All of a sudden, none of it made sense. She thinks, oh my gosh, I don't know what I want to do. This is terrible. It's so boxed in. I don't think I can handle this. This is sophomore year in college. You know, I'm thinking, this is normal. There's not a person in the world that probably hasn't gone through some kind of, am I doing the right thing? I don't know. And she is in tears on the phone. She can barely articulate what's going wrong in her life. And she's so sure she's disappointing us. And my husband and I, Peter, are thinking, this is normal. this is what everybody does. Don't worry, you'll figure out something. And so now she writes to say, and it wasn't even her time that she had to write. She just wrote and said, okay, I've talked to the theater design people, the set design people. I think I can match both the two majors together. I think I've got a path forward where I don't feel so boxed in, and it's all gonna be okay. And I'm still thinking, how did you know? How could you figure it out? I was so lame, and I'm so proud of her. So proud that she could figure it out. And who knows, maybe next year, maybe next quarter, it'll be the same thing. But you know, thank God there are people that get it, you know?
F, and I am a very slow learner. First of all, I never knew I was going to be up here tonight. I never knew. We had a very mean dog when I was in the 3rd grade. It had been given as a Christmas present. It was absolutely crazy. It bit everybody. It was always under quarantine, and and so I never knew until I was about 40 that my dad really didn't send that dog to live on the farm. I never knew that there was such a thing as real ESP, psychic energy, until I was married for about a year. I never realized that my wife could be more beautiful on the inside than she was on the outside. And I never realized until she said yes to marry me that it would be a good thing to go bald. When I was 19 years old, I was working in at the MGM casino in Reno. I had about 3 jobs, and I'd sat out a semester to live with my grandma, who had just lost my grandfather. She was very lonely. So one of my 3 jobs was on the graveyard shift at the MGM casino. I was a dishwasher. And I walk in the first night, they give me my uniform, and I go into the dishwashing room. And in this casino, there's all these dinner shows and all sorts of different restaurants, and I didn't know that all of the dishes from all of those different places funneled in on a conveyor belt into one dishwashing room. So I went in there, and everybody was probably about 8 other people in there. They were all Hispanic. They all were speaking Spanish, and at the time I did not speak any Spanish. And so the conveyor belt starts, and it's coming down, all these dishes, and all of them started taking food as it went through and eating it, okay? You know, all of them. And it completely freaked me out. And about 2 hours later, the break buzzer went off. And I was out of there. I went into the locker room. I left the little uniform that they gave me. And it wasn't until about 40 years later that I realized I got punked. They punked me. They did that to all the new guys. You know? I'm a slow learner, you know? When I was in the 5th grade, I was living in California, and we were heading to a Mexican restaurant we went to. My sister and I in the back seat. Dad driving, Mom in the front seat. And there was this real scary house. It was all decrepit, and it looked like it was out of a monster movie. It looked like a house of horror to me. So I think I would have been about 8. I think on that one, it was about a 50-year difference that so we drove by it, and I looked at it, and I said to my dad, "That looks like a whorehouse." And he pulled over, and he turned around and he said, "What did you say?" Look, it looks like a scary house, a house of horror. And he just said, "Oh, okay, all right." So, it takes a while to learn these things. I did not realize what a great friend my ex-wife could be until I left her and we got divorced. I did not realize what a great mother she was until I actually looked at the children that she left me. And I did not realize how courageous someone could be until she died a few months ago. We had 2 kids, have 2 kids, a son and a daughter. Son's older. All I had was a stinky sister when I was a kid, And I wanted a brother so badly. So that when my ex-wife was pregnant with our second child, secretly I wanted a boy so I could live vicariously through my son. We had a daughter. I think my mom kind of sensed the disappointment. Happy, but I wanted a boy. And she told me at that time that there is nothing like the relationship of a daughter to a father. And she will be your best friend someday. I never knew that. And that is completely true. And I never knew that I was a hero to my son until I was told by others. And finally, I never knew what a gift it was to forgive until I allowed myself to do that. Thank you.